Good evening and welcome to the New York Symposium with Diane Sayre. I'm Diane Sayre. I am a LaRouche independent candidate for U.S. Senate in 2024 now, the seat currently held by Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. We have a very important panel discussion this evening, and I will say right up front, as always, participation in the Sayre for Senate Symposium does not constitute endorsement of my or any candidacy, and I don't necessarily agree with the views of my participants, but we hold these symposia because there has to be a dialogue which is largely blocked from the mainstream press and the debates, as we discovered in my most recent election campaign, and certain things have to be known by the American public. So let me just say where we are. We're 9 days away from the Rage Against the War Machine rally in Washington, D.C. on February 19th, which is having, I think it's a great litmus test or a draw, like some kind of ant poison, because all the people who really are agents for war or the military-industrial complex, whether they're working for the FBI or CIA, are coming out to attack most of the speakers, and I find that actually useful. It's like the boy who cried wolf, where these slanders are not having such an impact. So I've been singled out for my association with LaRouche, who they claim was a racist, homophobic, extremist cult leader. Tulsi Gabbard has been accused of being in a cult. Ron Paul is a racist. Max Blumenthal is anti-Semitic. Jimmy Dore has asked people to sign outrageous non-disclosure agreements, etc., all to make sure that you don't have a united front. The speakers are very well aware that we have major and substantive disagreements with each other. But what we agree upon is that we have a real threat of thermonuclear war on the current trajectory. And if that horrible end occurs, we will not be able to even address any of the disagreements. So this is the first step, is to get off of this path. Now, today, there was an excellent Twitter space dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche hosted by Kim.com. And they had at least 2,000 people listening live. And I think what became the most important part of the discussion is the revival of the non-aligned movement, the move for 75% of the world's population to get off the sinking Titanic of this bankrupt transatlantic financial colonial wreck, and establish a new order of relations among nations, which is based on mutual respect, a commitment to get out of poverty, a commitment to not be bludgeoned by the great democratic leaders of the West, and that the United States is in a pivotal position either to obliterate this potential new paradigm or to become part of it. And of course, what I am proposing is that the United States should join this partnership. We should return to our mission as expressed by John Quincy Adams, or the goodwill engendered by the late President John F. Kennedy, that we work with other nations to ensure their freedom, not by telling them what to do, but by ensuring an economic level playing field that allows every nation to develop. Now, speaking of that, we have the absolute hideous situation in Turkey and Syria in the wake of this earthquake, where thanks to the US-led sanctions, the Caesar sanctions in Syria, 90% of their population is below the poverty line. They are unable to receive shipments and money and all kinds of things. The Treasury has just announced that they're lifting some of the sanctions for 180 days, but it's not even the ones that are really crucial to allow the kind of development needed. And I would say, had we not had this unjust policy, perhaps Syria would have been able to build infrastructure capable of withstanding this kind of shock. Turkey, similarly, if we had really an equal paradigm among nations, Japan, San Francisco, it is possible to create structures which are earthquake resistant. Also, a dear friend of mine, the Russian scientist Sergei Pulinets, has done work on earthquake forecasting, and the science has not really been put into it. But what he has demonstrated is that there are massive amounts of energy changing even weeks prior to an earthquake, and he has made a number of predictions that have been spot on. This research is not funded. Think about the lives that could be saved if such things were developed. And finally, I'll just say that we have the spectacle just at the time when Seymour Hersh has released another bombshell on the responsibility for blowing up the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines, which clearly lies with the US, our NATO allies, and he identifies nations like Norway, Denmark. For some reason doesn't mention, but I think people are aware of the damning text message sent by Liz Truss to Tony Blinken saying it is done, right as the pipeline was blown up. So that article comes out, and at the same time, Volodymyr Zelensky is visiting Buckingham Palace and the House of Commons, making more demands for weapons, heavy weapons, and also aircraft, and weapons that can strike deep into Russia. I think people should be aware of the very, very serious and dangerous implications if Ukraine becomes able to launch strikes far into Russian territory. And Putin and other Russian leaders have said nothing less, including Dmitry Medvedev, former president, who's now the deputy chair of the Russian Security Council, warning about changing their nuclear doctrine, using hypersonic missiles not to strike Ukraine, but American defense facilities in Europe and elsewhere. So this is definitely not comforting. So what I'm joined by people who have been in this fight for some time to end this policy of perpetual war, to help mankind grow up and grow out of participating and engaging in such barbaric activity. So I will first introduce a new friend and collaborator, Brad Wolf, who is a lawyer, former prosecutor, professor, and community college dean. And he's the co-founder of Peace Action Network of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is an affiliate of Peace Action and a partner of World Beyond War. And he is one of the organizers of the upcoming Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal. And I watched a couple of your videos, Brad, working on serving some subpoenas to various of these companies. So I will stop there and let you tell people your thoughts and what you're up to.
Great. Thank you, Diane. And thank you for facilitating this dialogue. It's important. And as you were talking about the earthquake, and in Syria and the damage done, just think of the money that could be spent for relief efforts there rather than on the U.S. war industry. And so that's part of our focus with this tribunal. I, along with Kathy Kelly and Nick Moddard and Sally Agazalia, decided about a year ago that we were going to convene a people's tribunal and that we were going to indict and put on trial in the court of public opinion United States weapons contractors, because we believe that there's a profit motive behind war, that these weapons contractors are not innocent bystanders responding to contracts issued by the Pentagon, but they are playing a role in aiding and abetting the United States government in facilitating war crimes, crimes against humanity, theft, and bribery. So that's what we've charged them with. And we're spending this year, an entire year, collecting documentary and videotaped testimonial evidence to prove that fact before the tribunal. The tribunal is going to be held next November 2023. It's going to be live streamed around the world. We've got a wonderful array of partners working with us on this. In addition to Kathy Kelly and Nick Moddard and myself, we've got folks like Cornel West and John Pilger, Ann Wright, Matthew Ho, Marjorie Cohn, Marie Dennis, William Astore, Christian Sorensen, a variety of military analysts. Had the pleasure of having Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson sit for an interview for the tribunal last month, and he had fascinating things to say about the U.S. war industry. And so the goal of the tribunal is to take 4 U.S. weapons manufacturers, and we picked Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, and General Atomics as the 4 who are indicative of the U.S. war industry and the way in which they foment needless war through their lobbying efforts of congressmen on the Armed Services Committee, through their revolving door to the Pentagon and the White House, from Lloyd Austin is a perfect example. Our current Secretary of Defense, prior to that, was on the board of directors of Raytheon. So he goes from Raytheon to the Pentagon to the military. So they foment this atmosphere of creating needless war, and they do it for money. So we decided to put them on trial and try to hold them accountable and see what they do through the eyes of victims who suffer these attacks. And we're taking a look at a lot of these attacks since 9/11. So in the last 20 years, we're collecting evidence that demonstrate these 4 contractors in particular created weapons knowing that they were going to be used against non-combatants, against civilians, and that they were going to be committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. And among the United Nations guiding principles is a section indicating that businesses are held to accountability and must cooperate when it comes to complicity in war crimes. So as we go forward, in addition to collecting testimony from military analysts and ex-Army officials like Colonel Wilkerson and William Astore and folks like that, we are also collecting video recorded testimony from the victims of these attacks. And the victims are coming from Syria, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, the occupied Palestinian territories, and they are providing the most compelling testimony as to exactly what is going on here with the U.S. war industry. And make no mistake, this war industry is taking money from U.S. taxpayers. It's draining the national wealth of this country and spending it not to make us safer, but to create a lot of pain and suffering across the world needlessly. And if that money were spent on things at home, such as providing housing, healthcare, education, and things of that nature, we would be certainly a lot better off. We would not be the target of so much vitriol abroad. So the idea is for us to, again, hold these weapons manufacturers accountable. Last November 10th, as Diane indicated, we served subpoenas down in Washington, D.C. on all 4 of these weapons manufacturers. And they were not thrilled to see us, but nevertheless, these subpoenas were delivered to them. And we are returning on February 14th, Tuesday, to Washington, D.C. to hold them in contempt for failing to comply with the subpoena. So we have a contempt citation to deliver to them on February 14th, Valentine's Day. That action's called Melt Your Cold, Cold Heart. We're going to be at Raytheon headquarters in Arlington, Virginia at 10:30 in the morning on Valentine's Day. And then we'll be at the Pentagon at 1 o'clock trying to deliver a subpoena to Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, compelling him to testify before the tribunal. And again, I'll say that this is a people's tribunal. They're being tried in the court of public opinion, but in France, the ECCR, along with others, have filed a lawsuit in the Paris court charging weapons manufacturers for similar activities regarding weapons used in Yemen. So there is a legal precedent for what we're doing. And we hope to press this issue, come up with a very compelling video tribunal next year, a written report issued by the judges of that tribunal, provide all the evidence to the U.S. Department of Justice, the United Nations, and other international agencies. It's a shame that the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court. If they would be, we could provide it to them and take action there. That's what's happening in France. So there's a lot of activity going on. We have a lot of work left to do. We're blessed with wonderful supporters and partners. We have a lot of students in college who are working with us, volunteering with us to do research on these issues, to look at the financial records and provide us with a lot of the information we need. So it's an international effort, and we're very happy and pleased with what we've got so far. I will say one final thing about Valentine's Day. There are events happening not just in Washington, D.C. that day, but there are events also happening simultaneously on the 14th in San Diego, California, where General Atomics is located. And General Atomics, if you don't know, are the primary manufacturers of drones. And so we wanted to bring a drone manufacturer into this tribunal to highlight the great damage that drone warfare is doing. So there's an action in San Diego on the 14th. There's an action in Asheville, North Carolina on the 14th, because Raytheon and Pratt & Whitney are very active down in Asheville, North Carolina. So there are individuals who are going to be delivering subpoenas there. New York City, they're going to be delivering subpoenas there. And Jack Gilroy, who will be on next, was also delivering subpoenas up in the Syracuse and Binghamton area to a variety of entities and public officials. So if folks are interested, they can go to our website, merchantsofdeath.org. All the information is there. There are steps to take action steps. You can download one of these subpoenas. And if one of those 4 contractors have an office in your area, which I'm sure that they do because they have offices purposely across the country, you can deliver one of these subpoenas to these offices. You can also deliver one of these subpoenas to your local congressman, compelling them to testify in front of the tribunal. And all this is a way, it's a public action to try to raise public awareness about what is going on with the draining of our wealth, to create this needless war abroad, and to generate a lot of death and suffering needlessly.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I definitely think there should be an audit of everyone in the Congress to see what stocks they are investing in and how they are profiting from this. And I will not delay further because we'll get to talk a bit more. But to introduce Jack Gilroy, who has been doing excellent work as an organizer with Veterans for Peace and Pax Christi. And I'll let him tell you more. I just saw that you had had a working relationship with Father McSorley, and spent time in prison and been in the Army and the Navy. This is very interesting, and just held, I thought, a very effective rally in Binghamton, New York, in front of Schumer's office, who richly deserves to be singled out. So thank you for joining us here, Jack, and why don't you go ahead?
Sure, and thanks very much, Diane. I enjoyed your presentation, and also really great to hear some of the legalities involved with Brad, who is a man who has spent a large part of his life in the legal world, and I've been in education, so I'll probably end up saying a few words about education, and maybe I hope I won't bore you because I've been around so long that I experienced some of this stuff firsthand. For example, what comes to mind as Brad tells about what he is doing to expose the merchants of death, it comes to mind to me that this is a very challenging thing, and it's actually, quite frankly, dangerous. When you think of some of the people who have stood up to the merchants of death over the years, it's really bad news. We know, I think somewhere in this list, I think, Diane, you were mentioning President Ike Eisenhower's comments in 1953. And in 1953, that's when he gave that famous speech, the Iron Cross, where referred to the use of the buying of guns and of planes and of ships as robbing from the people who really need it, the poor, the homeless. And then it was about 8 years later, as he was leaving in 1961, that he gave the speech that we're very familiar with, and that, of course, is when he identified the fact that beware of the military-industrial complex. He was already aware of it. He knew it, and he was worried about it as a four-star general, as a leader of the European campaign. He saw what happened after the war, that the warmongers and the profiteers from war were jumping right in. But so he leaves, and John Kennedy. Remember that his speech on June 10th of 1963 at American University was a speech that was not really given an awful lot of publicity. There was some information in the Washington Post, in the New York Times, not much. But it was very dramatic. And later on, people began to catch on with what John Kennedy was saying. And he was calling for a détente. He was calling for a change of mind, a change of attitude toward the Russians, that the Russians are like us, that they're people like us. And instead of having this hate relationship, it's time to put down the sword and begin to reduce the use of weapons, reduce nuclear weapons, reduce right down the board. It was only several months later that he was assassinated. And, I think enough has been written over the years to know that it was not a one-man deal. And enough has been said about certain government groups that were probably involved in it. And if you would really want to read about it, read James Douglas, JFK, The Unspeakable, who would documents right down the line those who were involved. And the fact that it was then Martin Luther King comes on to play a few years later. And remember that King gave that fabulous speech at Riverside Church in New York City on April 4th, 1967. And his aides were telling him, stay away from that business of militarism. It's dangerous. Don't do it. We have our own thing. Racism is what we have to focus. And he said, we have three major evils. And it's racism, it's militarism, it's poverty. Sometimes use the term materialism. But so anyway, what happened, we all know that he gave this speech where he said, the greatest purveyor of violence in the whole world is my own country. And that irritated the press throughout the country. It really upset even some of the black newspapers, Pittsburgh Courier, etc., were upset with it. 1 year to the day that he said that, he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. And keep in mind as well that the U.S. government again was apparently involved because the King family had a lawsuit that you may forget about in 1999. And in December of 1999, the U.S. government was convicted of, in a civil suit, participating in the assassination of Martin Luther King. So, I mean, there's danger out there because this is a very powerful group that are so intent upon continuing the stuff that they're doing. And if you jump ahead a bit to the 1990s with the 1989, remember that the Berlin Wall came down, and just a couple of years after that, we were ready to nevertheless test our weapons and have some victories because we weren't doing too well, right, in Vietnam. We lost big time in Vietnam, as well as killed maybe 3 million people. But so we perfected our weapons. And remember those photographs of conscripts, some Iraqi men running away from the machine gun fire, especially from helicopters, slaughtering people by the thousands. And for Americans, this was kind of a success, which again shows you a bit of the mindset of American ways. So I think that we have to realize that at that time, in 1991, that the people weren't hearing, and this is what we have a situation today, where David Dennis Kucinich says it's worse now than it was 20 years ago. Well, 30 years ago in 1991, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, FAIR, did a study as to how much the people were learning about the buildup to war in the Persian Gulf. And 1,229 minutes were recorded by interviews with merchants of death, that is, leaders of major industries, with colonels, generals, etc. And 28 minutes were devoted to opposition, and much of it was on C-SPAN with Colin McCarthy, who was a columnist for the Washington Post. In 1993, I had my high school students have a town meeting, and they invited, it wasn't Lockheed Martin at the time, it was called Martin Marietta. They invited Martin Marietta, General Electric, which was really big, even bigger than in the industries, Link Aviation, a small but nevertheless important defense group. Only Link came to this town meeting. And the auditorium was filled with people. It would have been a great opportunity for people to hear from some of the merchants, and they didn't show. Colin McCarthy, however, went back and wrote an excellent article in the Washington Post, but not too much longer after that, because of his constant violent criticism of Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, et cetera, the major organizations. He was removed from the editorial page to the style page. So Coleman eventually left and wrote a book called Teach Peace. I suggest that if you know any teachers, ask them to use that in the classroom to teach peace. So what do we have to do to try to break that situation? Economic conversion was a great idea, but it didn't last long. After 1993, we found new ways with the Clintons. With Clinton, of course, beginning to latch on to NATO and our actions in the Balkans. And of course, by 2001, March of 20 years and another month from now, March of 2001, 12 of us, Veterans for Peace and Peace Action people, had a large sign in front of the federal building in Binghamton that said, "This office is closed. The business of the United States government should not be war." And so we were arrested. We were put in the paddy wagon, put on trial, convicted. But Schumer, whose office was right behind us, the new senator, he, of course, voted for the war, right? Guy who never served in the military himself, of course, nor Biden, who, tough guys. These are real tough guys who like to kick ass around the world, but by the same token, are not willing to put themselves up in the front, to go line themselves up with the possible Russian offensive coming, for example. So these individuals, we really have to be tough on. We really need people around the country to begin going to the offices of United States senators, not just Schumer and Gillibrand. Gillibrand is on the Armed Services Committee, right? Not just these two, but every senator because you have almost total agreement as it was during the attack upon the Iraqi people. And we will have, again, we have amnesia, right? The United States of amnesia. We forget that about 1 million people died, with our attack on the people of Iraq, and 39 million, it sounds like it's not true, but 39 million people displaced. And people say, did we really do that? It's easy to forget. So here we are in 2023, the Ukraine situation going on. There are people who could step to the plate. We've talked before about how Pope Francis has already made suggestions that they even go to Vatican City, right, to discuss. They could go to Austria, which is a neutral country and will not send weapons. They don't make that many weapons because they are a very successful country without getting into manufacturing weapons. They like the neutrality that they have. It would be a good place for a sit down and negotiation that would deal with, number one, ceasefire, stop the weapons, and negotiation with obviously the need for some sort of compromise to come out of it all. So all I can do is say, if we can only get the passion to teach peace to our children in the earliest grades in schools, not like that terrible video that Diane was about ready to put on earlier in the program, a political video just glorifying the military, individuals who go for almost any reason they're told, because they're patriotic, supposedly, to kill, to bomb, to destroy. And these are the people who will be celebrated in a couple of days with flyovers for the Super Bowl, huge flags, right? Wonderful uniforms, bright uniforms, tall, handsome fellows, or individuals with camouflage indicating they're going to go out there somewhere and kick some more butt. All of that could be changed, but it's very difficult, but it can be done. It can be done if people try to not only do their own media, that's very important, to do your own media and to get it out on social media, to criticize this sort of thing, but also to try to make amends with some of the television people, to talk to them, to thank them, especially if they ever do show up. They need to be thanked. They need to be stroked. So I would suggest that you do all of those things as we move forward in some way to put maybe some moral emphasis as well. Besides the Pope, let's hear from the Methodist Federation for Social Action. Let's hear from Rabbi Michael Lerner, and let's hear from the people in the synagogues and the temples. Let's hear from the the Church Council throughout the United States, not just the Pope. It has to be people throughout the world with some sort of moral sense, and the people of religion claim that they have the moral sense. let's begin to hear from them. So that's about all that I have to say right now.
Well, thank you very much. Our next guest, and now I am going to play a little bit of that horrible video, is going to be Joel DeJean, who people who've watched know was my colleague and ran for U.S. Congress in one of the new districts in Texas against one of these merchants of death, actually, and also himself worked for companies as an engineer in the military-industrial complex and has some thoughts. But before we go to that, let us take a look at this ad, this terrifying ad.
Your mission, should you choose to accept it, will be to save Texas. To do so, you must recruit an exceptional team of congressional candidates. They must be courageous, patriotic, and absolutely fearless. Time is of the essence. The nation's future is dependent upon your success.
Still know how to fly one of these things? Dan Crenshaw. I'm putting a team together, Wesley. You in?
You know I wouldn't miss this for the world, right?
Whoops. Let me get out of here. All right, I think that's enough. We don't need to, I don't know what they're talking about, starting a war on the American people or what they're doing. But Joel, why don't you tell us about your thoughts on these matters, what you've heard so far? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Senator Sayre. That last speaker was Wesley Hunt, who flew Apache killer attack helicopters in Iraq and ran for Congress on his record of 55 combat missions, and actually said that he wanted to take his experience in Iraq to Capitol Hill. So I'm expecting to hear about an Apache helicopter attack on the Capitol. But I do believe in redemption, as Ann said, that in the 80s, I worked for one of the largest defense contractors in the Dallas area. And a few years ago, I read an article about an attack on a school bus in Yemen. And I was horrified to learn that the missile used on that school bus was part of a system that I worked on back in the 80s. A system designed to attack tanks and to prevent a Soviet Warsaw Pact attack on Western Europe. So these weapons were used to attack school buses, schools, funerals, weddings, power plants. So now we have to be hard on these companies, but I also recommend that we go after the Congress, because you just saw what's in the Congress now. 80 of these congressmen in this Congress are Iraq, Afghan veterans who are still proud of their service in the service of these merchants of death. Like I said, I do believe in redemption. Now, besides going after the board of directors of these companies, and we also must remember that Wall Street, the hedge funds, BlackRock, owns large chunks of shares in these publicly traded companies. but we must give these companies an alternative. For example, Boeing, which is famous for making the B-52 bomber that was used to carpet bomb Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, also made the Boeing 747 jetliner. General Atomics, besides building drones, has been working on magnetic confinement fusion for decades. And they also work with the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, where we recently had a major breakthrough where we had break-even in fusion at the National Lab, the National Ignition Facility. Lockheed Martin, besides making the F-35 stealth jet fighter, the most expensive jet fighter in the world, where the helmet the pilot uses itself costs $500,000, also builds spacecraft like the Juno spacecraft that is now orbiting Jupiter. And Raytheon, which bought the division that I worked for and now builds the type of weapon systems like the Javelin, the Patriot, the Stinger, and like Brad said earlier, had Lloyd Austin on the board of directors. Now, was he there to improve the design of some of these weapons? No, he was there to collect stock options that made him a millionaire. And he's not the only one in the military who's gone through this, serving on the boards, raking in millions, and then going back into the Pentagon. So it's up to the Congress, which has abdicated its responsibility to declare war for the last 70 plus years. Congress can't be left off the hook. The Senate, the Congress must be made to feel the heat. Now, like I said, we have to have the alternative. The alternative is, instead of wasting trillions of dollars on these useless wars, and we spent $2 trillion in Afghanistan. And what did we give the Afghan people? We gave them more misery, more death, and we increased the yield of the poppy fields 40-fold. That's what we did in Afghanistan. Now, this time we're playing with fire because it just so happens that Russia and China do have weapons of mass destruction equal to or superior to what we have. So the lunacy of using Ukraine as a proxy to attack Russia and tempting Taiwan to declare independence as an attack on China is a suicide pact. So again, we have to have the alternative. Elga LaRouche has laid out the 10 principles, and we have to accelerate the drive to hold these companies accountable, hold the Congress accountable, but then give them the alternative, the only alternative, which is peace through development. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. So I'll open it up. Before we do that, I would like Jose Vega, who is our AV man here, to share a video of a little talk that he and Kynan Thistlethwaite had last night with the current leader of the National Endowment for Democracy, who I'm happy to say I can't remember what his name is. But Jose, if you have that, we'd love to see it.
Excuse me, what about the corruption that the United States brings to all these other nations in the world? Afghanistan, we've taken over $9 billion in their foreign assets because we supposedly don't like the government, so we can condemn their population into starvation. What about Iraq? We went in there under false pretenses, under weapons of mass destruction, and we've left destruction in that nation. What about Syria right now? There's a terrible earthquake.
We're not here for that. Can you just sit down and listen to the talk, please?
And we're not sending them any aid because of these
Please sit down, sir. You can be sorted out.
There is no democracy that we're pushing in all these different nations. It's just fascism. It's just fascism. The United States is a fascist country.
The world has rejected your democracy. Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, everything you've tried to do has failed, and you will be forgotten. You are a plague, and guess what? The world has superseded your bullshit. No one will take it anymore. There is no democracy you're promoting. You've only brought death, and you know that, but guess what? It hasn't worked. You're going to die off like the plague you are. You are just like Ozymandias. Nothing will remain.
True, that's what's going to happen to this transatlantic junk heap. So I would like to just open it up, and everyone, please feel free to share your thoughts. Jose is pulling us all up here so we can be seen together. I will just say to start, I think this question, Joel raised it, and everyone in a sense, of the alternative. It's not like there's not a need for modern infrastructure. We have 2 billion people on the planet who don't have clean drinking water. We have hundreds of millions of people threatened with starvation. If you want to build a modern healthcare system in every country, you need a great deal of electricity, of clean water. And it seems, frankly, to me, that the profit to be made by producing things that raise the standard of living, that allow more people to live better on the planet, would actually be a more durable kind of profit. Maybe you wouldn't be in the mindset to, price gouge and totally line your pockets. But I think it's actually worse than being about money. I think these people are really committed to evil. I think they have an evil view of mankind. So, Brad, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Philip Berrigan, a great peace activist, used to say that we build our intentions into these weapons. And it's very true. These weapons are death incarnate. And so our purposes and our intentions of human beings are built into them. And so it's while money is a big driver, there is a malevolence behind what's being done here. And you mentioned a number of issues that the world is facing, from starvation to drought to climate change. We've got the Great Salt Lake drying up and the possible contamination of that. And you think about what $1 trillion a year could do to mitigate some of that. And that's what we're spending right now in defense in the United States, $1 trillion a year when you add in Department of Homeland Security and everything else. We've got 800 military bases around the world. The expense of all of these things is astronomical. The F-35 plane that Joel mentioned earlier, that's estimated to be a $1.7 trillion project over its lifetime, and it doesn't even work. I mean, there are so many technical problems and glitches with that fighter jet. So a lot of this money could be better spent and decrease anti-Americanism and terrorism rather than increasing it the way it's happening right now. These weapons, these wars are not making us safer, as I said before. They're making us less safe.
Absolutely. Jack, your thoughts?
Well, yeah, a number of thoughts. But what is happening right now that you mentioned in Syria and in Turkey, wouldn't it be a wonderful thing if the United States, instead of being a group or a nation that can send troops by the tens of thousands in a very short period of time to destroy, if we had a corps to respond to international disasters that we have so very, very often. Instead, we have to talk about a county in Los Angeles or a county in Tennessee sending some aid workers over, equipped very well to do a great job. But you're talking about 20,000 people dead, tens of thousands injured, buildings knocked about. And yet the United States, what are we doing? The French very often have beat us by sending teams to Haiti when Haiti has one of its frequent earthquakes or hurricanes, or the misery that those poor people have gone through. But the United States, with its focus on being the power to dominate, if we can break that dominance to something that if teachers would make this a teachable moment to teach their kids that it's time to show respect, care, and love for other people, and to ask their parents to support more diplomacy and more assistance for people around the world rather than harm. So if I think it's a teachable moment here now with this horror in Turkey and Syria, and I just can't believe. The other thing that was on my mind was the balloon that got that surveillance balloon, weather balloon, call it what you want. The ability to strike fear into the American mind is explained there very well, to the joy of the merchants of death, who know now that China is a bigger problem than we thought, because they have that surveillance balloon over the United States. And yet very little is said about the fact that many countries where we have drones 24/7 over their country, not just flying, but also sending missiles, Lockheed Martin Hellfire missiles and paveway bombs. We have killed, according to Azmat Khan, the reporter for the New York Times who did that expose. She proved that the Pentagon lied about all this, that it wasn't just an occasional accident, but it was thousands of people were killed. So here are people who can't even shoot down, American foreign objects over their country, and it's like it's not even happening. It's like the sleepwalk we're having to possible Armageddon. So how do we? I think again, what you're doing here is education. If we can only get these ideas out to school teachers, newspapers, and media, then we're on the right track.
I think also if we had corps of young people, I mean, Kennedy had the Peace Corps, but if college students could take a semester and go work in another nation. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt had an idea that I never had heard of, and I've mentioned it here before, but I really think it's worth considering. She proposed that young people at the age of 15, they should have a choice between a military service or a peace service, but that at the age of 15, they pick a country that they want to go to. And then they spend from the age of 15 to 18 learning the language, the geography, the culture, everything. And then they spend 2 years in that country working with them to solve certain problems, et cetera. And she said, what an amazing amount of goodwill that would spread toward the United States. And also you'd have a whole generation of people, potential leaders, who actually could see the world through someone else's eyes or have an insight other than just their own from the United States. And this is really not discussed, but I think that would be a phenomenal opportunity. Nowadays, most Americans, I think, don't even speak more than one language. We barely speak one language because we don't teach people literacy anymore, and we can't test it, and Shakespeare is being banned. I mean, it's really terrible. But if there were a mission where people knew they could do something good and durable, I think you would see a lot of the attitude changing, and you'd see people really hungry to learn. Joel, I'm sure you have something to say about this.
Yes. Well, first, there is an unconfirmed rumor that Joe Biden will schedule a nationwide televised address for March to announce the formation of the BDI, the Balloon Defense Initiative. We will develop their technology to finally make the world safe from balloons. There is another weapon that we have not mentioned that is not manufactured by any company, and that is the weapon of sanctions. And if you remember, about 25 years ago, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was actually asked on 60 Minutes by Leslie Stahl. It is reported that 500,000 Iraqi children have died, and this is in the 90s. This is not the second Iraq war. This is the first Iraq war. And she answered, she was asked, was it worth it to constrain Saddam Hussein and accept the loss of 500,000 Iraqi children? And she said, yes, it was worth it. And you brought up Haiti. Now, I was born in Haiti. And I remember 5.5 years ago, there was a glimmer of hope when China offered to build water treatment, sewage treatment, and a power plant that would triple the electrical supply in Haiti. Offered to build this for the capital, Port-au-Prince. And the US State Department and the International Monetary Fund said, no, you have to pay your debts. So sanctions have killed probably more people than even some of these deadly weapons. So we have to cut off all these sanctions. We have to lift the sanctions from Syria, lift the sanctions from Cuba. We've been sanctioning Cuba for 62 years now. And we still have sanctions on Haiti. So we have to lift the sanctions, close all these military bases, and bring the troops back so they can work on rebuilding the United States instead of trying to blow up the world.
Feel free to jump in, anyone.
I would just add, we're talking about humanitarian efforts and the good that they can do across the globe. And just think, after 20 years in Afghanistan, all the death and destruction we created there and the failed effort that we had there, what if instead of launching that military invasion, we would have built 3,000 hospitals, one in the name of everybody who died at 9/11? Think of the good that would have done. Would we be better off now if we had done that rather than invade? Would the Afghani people be better off if we had done that rather than invade? So I think there's a lot of ways that the U.S. can use its power and its influence across the globe for good instead of causing so much difficulty and so much harm. And what we've been discussing here are just some of the ideas. It's education, it's student exchange and things like that. So all excellent ideas.
I think there are countries too that we need to hold up to children and other people. And Costa Rica, for example, would be a shining example, whereas so many countries in Latin America are struggling. Costa Rica, which does not have an army, they're able to take their monies and invest and to improve the lives of their people, to make the country a better place. Austria, which very little in textbook say that it was the Russians who agreed to pull out of Austria first in 1955. The Americans were willing to do it as well, the French and the British. They left in Austria, declared neutrality, and they have not had to spend huge amounts of money on the military. Individuals, if they want to serve, they can serve to the country just in a social manner in hospitals, or work at some of the former concentration camps in Austria from their past. So they have learned from their past, the horrors of the past, and it's a prosperous country. It's a wealthy country. It's an attitude of the people that no, they're not sending any weapons to the Ukraine, because probably they don't have a heck of a lot to send them in weapons, and they definitely will not interfere in any way with the war in the Ukraine, but they would be willing to serve as a place where negotiations could take place. So I would hope that this idea of having negotiations for this war in either Vienna, which has a long history of having negotiated peace, or at Vatican City, where the Pope has said he is willing to bring people and to be there. And there was a statement that the Pope, if you don't mind me, just take in case you happen to miss it. Here's what Francis said. And some of us are trying to work through, without going into any detail right now, because it's sort of undercover kind of situation, to get to Francis for a stronger position for negotiations. But he said, we must all be pacifist, wanting peace. not just the truce that maybe only serves to rearm, but a true peace, which is the fruit of dialogue. Peace is not achieved with weapons because they don't defeat hatred and the thirst for domination, which will remain perhaps in shown in other ways. And I match that with JFK, the one-time warrior JFK. And we forget this quote that JFK made. He said, "War will exist until that distant day when the conscientious objector enjoys the same reputation and prestige that the warrior does today." And if people could see that, the rest of that film that you showed part of it, boy, talk about it, glorifying the warrior, and all of those people elected to Congress for their being proud of these deeds of death and destruction, and they're held up and glorified, and they will be again, Super Bowl Sunday. So that it's a major job that we have. It's a decade. It's a generational kind of change that's needed. But we have to start. Colin McCarthy used to say, "Well, what do you do?" And he would say, "Start. And so that's what we've got to do.
Good. Well, I hope we change in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, as some have said, because I think we don't have time. And changes like that, it's an imperceptible shift, and the entire outlook is different. And of course, it will take years for the policy to catch up, or the physical reality of the change to catch up with the change, but it has to occur. Now, we had a comment come in, Joel, someone has proposed, instead of the strategic balloon initiative, or whatever you're calling it, that it should be the strategic buffoon initiative, or the buffoon defense initiative.
We wouldn't have to train because they're already trained to be buffoons. So.
Yes, and also, Jack, if you wanted to say more, because I know you are working closely with the Schiller Institute on this initiative, which Helga Zepp-LaRouche announced to encourage all religious leaders of all different faiths to support the Pope's initiative to offer the Vatican as a place for mediation. And also Lula da Silva is in the US right now, and he called for a very interesting idea, which is that a group of nations, a block of nations with enough nations to be credible, to have some weight, to organize peace talks. But Jack, if you want to say more about that initiative, I think.
I probably won't, Diane, because I was curious that just a few nights ago, I just couldn't sleep. I was thinking about this. I went out and I wrote a letter to Marie Dennis, who is the co-director, for International Pax Christi. And I wrote her a note, and she came back 2 minutes later. This is 2 a.m. So we were both thinking of the same thing, and it was around this whole process that you're mentioning, and she said, could you just hold off until we, because she's working with some pretty high level individuals to formulate this letter. So I'll just won't say any more than that.
No, that's fine. People should know that it exists, and the moment that people finally realize, and I think that's also a hard thing to consider unless you can consider the alternative, which is why it's so important that everyone has brought up what mankind actually could be doing, because sometimes it's very, very hard to face the terror of what is staring us. I mean, it's like an onrushing freight train. Every time you say, well, they wouldn't really do that. They're not really going to send tanks, then they're sending tanks. Well, we're supposedly not going to have troops on the ground. We do have troops on the ground. There was a French journalist who said virtually everything going on in Ukraine is directed by the US and the UK. We know Boris Johnson flew there personally, probably on a jumbo jet because of his pompous weight, to stop the negotiations last March. So people should not, I think we have to disabuse ourselves of the notion that somewhere there's a line where rationality kicks in. We've seen that we keep the behavior of the Western so-called leaders, misleaders, becomes less and less rational. And that is why it is so urgent that people move for the solution and move for a change of thought. And I couldn't agree more with what you just read from Pope Francis in terms of what's involved. It's not a truce. Peace is not merely the absence of war. It requires a change in heart, requires a change of heart. And that's something that human beings are capable of, thankfully, but each of us is sovereign and we cannot make people change. So the question is to appeal to their reason and hope people find it within their hearts to make the changes that are required right now.
It's entirely possible. I mean, I do this work and I think others do it because we believe peace is possible. This is not trying to defy the laws of physics. This is entirely possible. It's a matter of perception that needs to be changed, and it can be done.
Exactly. Well, go ahead, Joel.
The other thing that JFK proposed in his last two speeches was that the US and at that time the Soviet Union jointly go to the moon. Well, now the US should propose to jointly not only go back to the moon, but using the helium-3 on the moon for fusion rocket-propelled ships to jointly go back to the moon with China, Russia, the European Space Agency, and to mount a exploration of Mars in the coming 20 to 40 years. That's how long it's going to take to develop the technologies. But instead of worrying about Chinese balloons, we should be working with China to go to the moon, working with Russia like we have been doing for over 20 years on the International Space Station, and use our defense dollars for space exploration, and the money won't be spent in space, it'll be spent right here where we can develop the infrastructure necessary to make the human species extraterrestrial.
Thank you. Jack, any closing thoughts? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, yeah, Brad has been working so very hard to bring about some excellent investigations and testimony, really. I mean, to get somebody like Noam Chomsky or Cornel West, et cetera, takes a little bit of doing. And it's not just a 10-minute talk. He has a lot of editing to do and hours of documentation. And it's been going on for a long period of time. So I'm going to have a little advertisement for Brad. Brad has this terrific shirt that sort of explains what the can you see that?
Yes.
That's a T-shirt that he has online, and if you go to merchants.org, the shirt is there. So I hope that maybe we see some of these at gatherings in coming weeks and months. And I just wanted to say too that I wish you luck, and the spirit be with you on the 19th, and with all other individuals who are speaking at a very, very important time.
Thank you very much. And with that, I'd really like to encourage people, one, visit schillerinstitute.com to see this initiative around the Peace Initiative of the Vatican. And anyone who can, please join me and others in Washington, D.C. on February 19th. We cannot allow the NAG networks to get the upper hand. The power of this gathering is the diversity of the participants in all of our political views. And there will be a bus. The Schiller Institute is chartering a bus from New York City. If you are interested in coming down on the bus, please call. I'll put the number in the comments, 646-328-9899. 1932, 646-328-1932. And otherwise, I hope that I will see everyone here, all of you next week. It'll be the last Friday symposium before the February 19th rally. And I want to thank very much Brad. It's really nice to meet you this way. I hope in person at some point. Jack, yes, same thing. Thank you. And thank you, Joel DeJean. And we'll be meeting again, I'm sure, somewhere soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.